Hello, welcome to PA 315, Chapter 5, Civil Rights. So the previous chapter, Civil Liberties, leads naturally into Civil Rights chapter, and there's quite a bit of overlap, of course, and you will be hearing a lot of the same amendments and concepts, this time looking specifically at civil rights issues. So beginning, we look at the history of the United States, and unfortunately, it's well grounded in racism, exploitation of different groups, and a lot of pretty terrible things. Over the years and generations, we have come to correct some of these wrongs, and we've done well in some cases and not so well. And sometimes we cycle back and forth where we start to make progress and we go backwards and we make progress. But I think all in all, progress has been made and needs to be made further. So if we look at the United States and its founding, the late 18th century, you have a couple things contextually that play a role. First, you have the fact that the United States as colonies was set up to produce raw materials for Great Britain. So you had these large plantations in the South, lots of cash crops, not only in what became the United States, but also in the Caribbean and South America. So there is that element there where there was this need and greed to have a large workforce that they didn't have to pay. And slavery was common. It came to the United States in the 16th century and has been around ever since in what's currently the United States. It came about even prior to that in other parts of the Americas. So during this time, late 18th century, we see the Industrial Revolution. It's already ramped up in Europe, and this is changing human life as we know it. And we discuss this a lot in PA 200. And with that Industrial Revolution comes the introduction of the cotton gin by Eli Whitney in 1793. And so this makes something that was fairly difficult to do, which is produce a cotton fabric for textiles, clothes, and other things, a lot easier to do. So the demand for cotton shoots up with the introduction of the cotton gin. Before that, there was wool, was used, different hemp products, etc. But cotton was definitely a preferable material to those. So Southern states had a greater dependency to begin with in agriculture and slavery, and then with the cotton gin, now you had this massive push to grow as much of this stuff, similar to how tobacco and some of these other cash crops, molasses in the past, to grow cotton throughout the United States, which would grow in the South, obviously not in the colder North. The amount of raw cotton yield doubled for several decades after 1800. The demand was so high. One thing that had happened, as we had discussed previously, was the founding of the nation with the Constitution. They put an end to the overseas slave trade, meaning no longer could anyone bring any slaves to the United States in 1808. It was the 20 years. And that came up in 1808. However, the demand for slaves was increasing. So the only source of the slaves were already here and slaves who would reproduce. So there was an impetus on that to get as much of that commodity as they could. And it was an awful, terrible, reprehensible thing that's stained this country as we see till today. We still see issues related to institutional racism. So as this is building up in the 19th century, you have the United States starting to split into two groups. And the groups generally are North and South. And what you have is the United States is growing and taking more native land and building out into what were French and other territories and other native communities. There is a desire to keep this balance between the North and South from getting lopsided to one side or the other. And with the formation of the state of Missouri, you had the issue of whether it would be a slave state or a free state. Right at this point, there was an even number of free and slave states. So the Missouri Compromise of 1820 said, okay, we're going to allow Missouri to be a slave state. However, any territory north of the 36th parallel, and this followed the Louisiana Purchase, which we'll talk about in a second from France, will be a free state. And in order to balance the number of states, the state of Maine was created, and that was actually part of Massachusetts prior to becoming its own state. So then the numbers were equal again, and you had this detente. Unfortunately, in 1857, the Dred Scott v. Sanford decision by the Supreme Court, which was, unfortunately, a racist Southern dominated court, decided that the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional. You can't tell states to be free or slave owning. That's up to each state. And it declared also that slaves were property and therefore not US citizens or people with any human rights, and could not, in the case of Dred Scott himself, address any issues in the court of law, as they are not people. So it's a pretty terrible decision there. And this led to further issues between that North and South group. Now, in the North, as we discussed in PA 200 quite a bit, you had the Industrial Revolution really taking form. And so even though the cotton was being produced in the South, the cotton gins actually were in the North, in the East Coast, and they were actually producing the product. The South was really just a raw materials production plantation culture. So if we look at the Louisiana Purchase from France in 1803, you see this very large area in the center that extended, of course, into Canada at many points as well, in previous incarnations. And if you've been here, I grew up in Michigan, but even Illinois, and if you go through much of that area, you'll still see a lot of French names. You still see a lot of French influence in Michigan. Detroit, the largest city in Michigan, is Detroit, which means the area where the lakes narrow. So there was a lot of French activity in the central portion of the United States for decades. However, in 1803, France decided to sell this to the United States, and the reason was because a leader of France at the time named Napoleon was waging war in his effort to conquer most of Europe, and decided they needed the money. And so they sold that. The United States gave them the money, and they went on to try to take over Russia, which is never a good idea. And Napoleon, of course, lost. And then you see the other territorial acquisitions from 1783 onward, Texas, Mexican secession in 1848, which gave birth to California in its current form, and some other areas purchasing from Spain in 1821. That also was an issue of money, Spain needing the money. And the Oregon Country and the British claims were more of an active force, as was Texas and the Mexican secession. So first civil rights movement, abolition and women's rights. So there's been a movement against slavery really for hundreds of years in this country. And one of the earlier, stronger organized groups was the American Anti-Slavery Society, and that was William Lloyd Garrison and Arthur Tappan. And they were journalists and abolitionists, meaning against slavery, as well as suffragists. And suffrage means a political franchise. It means having the power to participate in politics and civic life. And suffrage movement in this country is more often, it's used for the right for women to vote. And that had been going on for as long as the civil rights movement had been going on in the 19th century. So even with the early anti-slavery society groups, you did have also a component of, we also want suffrage movement or women's voting rights to be part of this. The women's rights groups gained notoriety at the Seneca Falls, New York Convention in 1848. And that was put together by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott. And they were pioneering suffragists as well as abolitionists and social activists. From that convention, you had the Declaration of Sentiments, which demanded equal social status and legal rights for women, including the right to vote. A later meeting of the same group, you had the famous poem that was recited by Sojourner Truth. She was a former slave, and it's Ain't I a Woman? That was in 1851. And she actually went on to win a court case to get her son from the slave owner. She recruited former slaves to fight for the Union later in the Civil War, and fought for land reparations for ex-slaves after the Civil War as well. And of course, Harriet Tubman was very prominent prior to this as being an engineer of the Underground Railroad in freeing slaves from her family and friends, and then later many other different slaves from the South to the North, and then eventually mostly to Canada. And the reason that they couldn't just stay in the North, which had free states, which didn't allow slavery, is racism was prevalent there. And it was prevalent in the form that Congress actually put forth many laws, as we saw, called fugitive slave laws and other fugitive laws, where slaves who escaped had to be returned to their owners in the South, even in free states. So oftentimes the slaves fleeing from the South would end up in Canada, though many did stay in the North. Uncle Tom's Cabin was a very famous book, came out 1852, and it was by Harriet Beecher Stowe. And she was a white author, and she's an abolitionist. And President Lincoln actually said the little woman who started the big war. Her book was so popular, and it really showed the cruelty of slavery, to the Northerners, who would read this book and be appalled at the conditions in the South and the whole institution of slavery itself. And again, when we look at these changes, usually it's not just one group here, one group, there. It's a political movement, it's a cultural movement, it's a contextual movement. These things all drive major changes in society. Oops. So the Civil War, of course, happens 1861 to 1865. You have the Confederate States form, and they secede from the Union, and it's a bloody 500,000 people killed, and it's a mess. And from that come 3 amendments, as we read about: the 13th Amendment, the 14th, and the 15th. And the 13th Amendment, the first, outlaws slavery. Of course, you see that part there: except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted. So that goes into play with the documentary that we're watching this week, that you should have watched it by now. And you can see how all of a sudden there was other ways to subjugate and exploit people of color in this country. We're unfortunately very cruel and creative at these types of things, and keeping different groups down and exploiting them. In response to this, many parts of the South passed laws. They were called the Black Codes, and they were passed basically trying to restrict African Americans' rights and forcing them to work in low-wage labor economy and acquire debt. And it was designed, to keep the power in the group of the white landowners. And it wasn't just in the South, and you could even look north, Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, New York. They enacted Black Codes. And a lot of that was around the fear that all of these African Americans would come from the South into the northern cities. And there was a fear that, what do we do? Fear of the unknown, and fear that these were groups that didn't have a lot of resources. And so they would create these Black Codes in the North as well. In response to that, in 1866, we actually have our first civil rights law. the Civil Rights Act, and that was to make sure that these black codes were shut down and that the amendment was carried out, as well as the addition of the 14th and 15th Amendment, just to clarify and make sure that these changes were taking place. So in 1968, you have the 14th Amendment, and that is one of the primary, as we discussed in the last chapter. And it's in this chapter, one of the primary civil rights and civil liberties amendments with the Due Process and Equal Protection Clause. And that's really created a doorway to right some of these wrongs that we've seen over the generations. The 15th Amendment, 1870, if it wasn't clear in the 13th and 14th, they needed the 15th Amendment to state that African American men had the right to vote, but it excluded women, and specifically so, it's actually the first time that says male, the word male is used in the Constitution. And women, actually, the women groups that had worked with the abolitionists were upset and were actually against the 15th Amendment because they wanted the amendment to include the rights of women to vote as well. And so that created some bad sentiment and actually created splits in the groups, and the National Women's Suffrage Association was created just to oppose the amendment since it did not support the voting rights. The more famous Civil Rights Act is the 1875 Act. And this comes after, if you remember, in 1870, just a few years before, you had the Amnesty Act, whereupon all of the former Confederates or those associated with the Confederacy, essentially, millions of men who held power in the old racist regime, were given the right to vote again and to participate in government. So that kind of put an end to this temporary, more diverse group of African Americans and others who had risen to levels in government and elected officials, etc. So with that gone, you had the old group kind of coming back in, and so they saw all of these problems in the South, and they wanted to make sure again that they would be enforcing the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. And so this is why the Civil Rights Act of 1875 is sometimes called the Enforcement Act or the Force Act. And this was during Reconstruction, of course. And this actually guaranteed equal treatment in public accommodations, public transportation, and prohibit exclusion from jury service, lots of these other things. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court overturned it in 1883, which began this move towards segregation in the South. Reconstruction, of course, ended in 1877. It's very expensive to keep all of these federal troops there in the South. They felt, had to rule itself. Unfortunately, the South reverted back to the Old South, and the protection for African Americans was gone. Just after Reconstruction, you see what are called the Jim Crow laws appearing all over the South. And these are state and local laws designed to enforce segregation of blacks from whites, to disenfranchise blacks from voting. There's so many different ways. And this was really setting the stage for these white Southerners to reassert their dominance over African Americans in every facet of life. Again, later the court had a very unfortunate ruling that upheld segregation. So Jim Crow laws now were being challenged in 1896 in Plessy v. Ferguson. And the court said that separate but equal is fine, and that segregation therefore does not violate equal protection or the 14th Amendment. And many people feel that that was one of the worst moments in the court's history. So the push for equality, we have to look contextually again. 1890, even maybe a little bit before then, a little bit after 1920, there's a rough, time frame. You had the Progressive Era. And Progressive Era, these were reformers. They were interested in putting together child labor laws. They didn't want children working in factories. They were against monopolies, big business exploiting the land and people. They were for voting rights for women, for the suffrage movement. They were against political corruption. They were against discrimination against African Americans for the most part, many of them. And they were also for professionalizing government. And that was the birth of the public administration field at that time. And this was, trying this move away from the Andrew Jackson era of, having these basically tools of the elected officials running government whose only interest was loyalty, to actually having professionals who were trained and would have tests in order to be able to work in certain fields. They had to show that they had the ability to be competent. So that was moving. You see local government and other government groups, the council manager form of government coming during this time. Just a movement to better government and more fair, equitable government. During this time, you did have race-related protests in North Carolina and Atlanta that were very large. You also started to see different types of protests in northern cities as during World War I, many African Americans moved north. Some had started to move north after the Civil War, but especially during World War I, because a lot of the white workers in the factories were going to war, and so they needed to produce many different things for the war machine, as well as just regular everyday products, and they needed workers, so they came up during that time. And this scared a lot of other immigrant groups at the larger northern cities, and they felt that this was a threat. So we see in Chicago, you had a group of white men throwing rocks at African-American teen because he was swimming in the whites only area in Lake Michigan. And if you think that segregation was only in the South, that's not true. There was pockets of it all through the North as well. And police refused to arrest these people. This started some violence. You had the South Side gangs that were African-American, as well as many other immigrant group gangs at the time. They could be Irish, Italian, Polish. They start fighting. The state militia had to be deployed. 15 white, 23 black persons killed. Estimate, who knows what the real number was. 1,000 African Americans lost their homes to arson during this. And of course, a very famous incident that is now being talked about quite a bit in its 100th year anniversary of the Tulsa Race Massacre. And that's where you had the destruction of the Greenwood District, which was also known as Black Wall Street, though it wasn't really like a Wall Street like we think of in trading stocks and bonds. It was just a lot of businesses and very successful African Americans there. They felt there was jealousy, or there was other issues with the white population of Tulsa. And so certain incidents would happen, and African Americans were accused of something here or there. And finally, the white establishment, local government decided to attack and destroy, even using planes to bomb buildings, and destroy 36 blocks of this Greenwood district, and killing anywhere estimates between 75 and 300 African Americans. So there's been always, unfortunately, these incidents in this country far before what we think of as the 60s riots, where we had issues with this. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, still around and very strong today. That was founded in 1909, and it was founded as a biracial group. You had two different founders, W.E.B. Du Bois and Oswald Garrison Villard, and it was to advance civil rights justice. And W.E.B. Du Bois, excuse me, I said the French pronunciation, he was the founder, a co-founder of the predecessor called the Niagara Movement, that was against racial segregation and disenfranchisement. And Oliver Garrison Villard, he was a journalist, he was white, and civil rights activist and editor of the New York Evening Post. So he had quite a bit of reach, especially in the North. Oops. This thing's being a little fussy, I apologize. So, well, we have the civil rights movement going on for African American rights. You have the suffrage movement also working toward some sort of gain. They didn't see the gains that they were hoping for in the 19th century. And in 1890, the National American Women's Suffrage Association was formed by Susan B. Anthony. And you had the merger of two rival women's rights organizations after 21 years. This would be after the 15th Amendment split. And this eventually became the League of Women Voters, which is still around today and very involved in political elections. They usually host political debates, not only at the national level, but at the local level. I was in a debate when I ran for county commissioner in Michigan, in Washtenaw County, and lost, but it was an experience. It was fun. And I went to a debate that was hosted by the League of Women Voters for Washtenaw County. The National Women's Party in 1916, that split from the National American Women's Suffrage Association and just was to focus on an amendment, which became the 19th Amendment. And they were put together and it actually was passed in 1920, 50 years after African American men were allowed to vote, women were allowed to vote. And of course, I shouldn't say of course, but mostly southern states such as Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Maryland, Mississippi, South Carolina, Virginia voted against it. However, it did receive enough votes to pass. And at the same time, the National Women's Party put forth the Equal Rights Amendment, the first incarnation of that. And then ever since, that was actually in 1923, a few years later, and that's been going to Congress ever since. It has not passed. So litigating for equality, what you read in the text is you see this pattern of where different groups have attorneys who are put together a legal defense, and usually legal defense and educational fund, in order to have test cases to bring up to federal courts to see if they can win at that court and bring it to the Supreme Court in order to fight some of the injustices. And we see one of the major first ones, and that's with Thurgood Marshall, who was leading this NAACP LDF effort. He later became a Supreme Court justice. And Brown v. Board of Education was actually 5 cases, and Brown, we know it as Brown because that was alphabetically the first case. And it struck down the separate but equal. It was showing that separate doesn't mean equal. And this concept needs to be stricken from the record. And you also had the Brown v. Board of Education 2, they call it, you have that language of with all deliberate speed, but that was a bit vague and when changes needed to be made. Desegregation was not immediately implemented, so you had further issues that had to be handled. You see also the issue with in the 50s in Arkansas, where you had President Eisenhower actually send in an airborne division to make sure that African-American children wanting to go to the school, the white school, were allowed to do so. Of course, after that, the governor closed that school just to make more issues and problems. We see Cooper v. Aaron, and this also just exemplifies that the ruling in Brown v. Board of Education is the supreme law of the land, and it's binding on all states, and that's regardless of any state laws contradicting it. Because a lot of the southern states were trying to create laws to contradict it. They said, not so fast. And the better explanation of this, watch the video in the module, Civil Rights of the 1950s. It goes through it fairly quickly, but it's a great quick reference. So we see the 50s being a real pivotal point for the civil rights movement in the 50s and the 60s, of course. And the Montgomery bus boycott that happened, Rosa Parks, she worked for the NAACP. She was the secretary she decided not to give up her place on the bus. We've all heard this story and you read about it. And then they boycotted the city bus system, which relied on African Americans and their money to survive, and eventually proved successful. And it was ruled unconstitutional in 1956. From that, you saw a young minister, which you read about and everyone knows, Martin Luther King Jr., and he created the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And he preached nonviolence, integration between whites and blacks. During that same time as well, you had the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and the Freedom Riders. So originally it was African American college students sitting in lunch at lunch counters, and then it became many other students from the North, both black and white, and they would come down and be beaten and jailed and killed in some cases, but fighting just to kind of break down and to accelerate the desegregation process. Unfortunately, that group was heavily infiltrated by the FBI and disintegrated in the 1970s. And that was J. Edgar Hoover, who always was, unfortunately, there was a lot of racist undertone to his policies. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, it was proposed in 1963 by President Kennedy. Of course, he was assassinated November 22nd, 1963. His vice president, President Johnson, took the mantle and pushed it through and got the Civil Rights Act passed in 1964. And that outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin, and prohibited unequal application of voter registration requirements, racial segregation in schools, employment, and public accommodation. So not only did you have the court cases, Brown v. Board of Education, now you actually had the law specifically addressing this. Initially, the powers to enforce the act were weak, but have been supplemented in later years. And there was a constitutional basis, of course, and that's the 14th Amendment. So women's rights after the 19th Amendment, women have a right to vote. You see kind of it's not as strong of a movement or public, but a new women's rights movement comes up out of the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s. As we read, and you see three key issues, or four, in this new women's rights movement. And you see the creation of the President's Commission on the Status of Women, and that was by President Kennedy. And then to head that commission was Eleanor Roosevelt, former First Lady and former UN ambassador. You have the publication of The Feminine Mystique by Betty Friedan in 1963, and this was basically questioning this whole role of women in Western society as kind of a second-class citizen, and that women should, break those bonds. And of course, the Civil Rights Act itself of 1964. So National Organization for Women now, that's founded in 1966, a few years after her book. And that's with Betty Friedan, Shirley Chisholm, Pauli Murray, and Muriel Fox, and is still around today and very powerful. You have the Equal Pay Act of 1963, and that requires equal pay for equal work, and that's been a law in the books for generations, and we haven't seen that come to fruition. We haven't seen enforcement of that as it probably should be. You see Title IX of the Education Amendments of 1972, and that was big. And that bars educational institutions that receive federal funds from discriminating against female students. And so this means that if there's men's sports, there has to be women's sports. If there's men's, any sort of extracurricular activity that's specifically for men, it should also be offered to women. And it also sets forth sexual harassment and other claims and gives them validity and an instrument to address those things. So that was a massive movement in 72. At the same time, starting in the 50s, but through the 60s and until today, you have with Hispanic Americans, Latinx, different civil rights movements in that regard. One of the major first cases was Hernandez v. Texas. And basically that said, the Supreme Court decided that the jury should include other Mexican Americans. You know, if you have a Mexican American or Latinx person, there should be Latinx people on the jury. You cannot have a jury that doesn't represent their peers. Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta, I'm sure you've all heard about that. And that was the United Farm Workers Union. And a very similar approach to Martin Luther King. He really pushed hard for the farm workers that were in California, as well as in Arizona and the United States. And he made it a moral cause and had nationwide support. This actually is a picture in Calexico during the lettuce boycott. The Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund, similar to the NAACP, Legal Defense and Educational Fund. This is so that groups can challenge in certain cases, you know, have these test cases and bring them to the federal level to challenge some of the injustices. It's a national nonprofit. It's formed 1968 and has been very, very active. One of the major challenges was the Texas local at-large elections. And at the time, there were ways in which, even with very large percentage of Hispanic Americans, if you have local government broken down with an at-large election for an area, you could have 35, 40% Latinx population, but if it's at large, therefore not representing individual districts that would have a different diversity from each other, you could have that majority group, if it's white, 51 to 55%, voting for all of their representatives, and the minority group, whether it's Hispanic or African American or any other group, would never have a chance to have a representative. So they challenged those at-large elections and wanted to have district and elections where they could have representation in government. You have the National Hispanic Leadership Agenda, and HLA, and that works on public policy issues affecting Latinx community, and that was formed in 1991 by Henry Cisneros. And now looking at the Native populations, I just wanted to throw this in there. It's not in the text, but just to get an idea, sometimes we think that, you know, we forget how many different groups and different nations there were here prior to European arrival. There really isn't a point on this map where you don't see, you know, a name of various different groups, and that the various different groups were just that, different languages, cultures, etc. So Native populations were highly affected with the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. And this originally had a good intent. So establish a government for the Northwest Territory, and that's now the states of Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, Minnesota. And it created a process for admitting a new state and guaranteed that any new state would be equal to the original 13 states. But it also said that agreements with the Native population and respect for their land had to be maintained. That those in the United States, Americans coming out there had to respect any territory that the natives, you know, had possession of at that time, and that they should be treated with respect and honor all of our contracts, all that stuff. Of course, that didn't last and wasn't enforced. To give an example, prior to the Europeans coming to what is now the United States, there's estimates of 2 to 18 million for a Native American population. And that declined to about 600,000 by 1800. So just as America's forming, late 18th century, you have about 600,000. And another 100 years, you're looking at less than half again, about 250,000 remaining. Now, a lot of that was disease, but a lot of it was through their resources being taken, being killed, etc. The Dawes Act in 1887, this was put forth in the, especially out in the West, were at the time higher concentrations of natives. Most of the natives in the East had been um, killed off or had moved or were forcibly moved or had were put in reservations, cut from society for the most part. Some had integrated, but they wanted to end communal ownership of the land for native populations, even though that was the culture, and they parceled up the pieces of each of these areas that they deemed were Native American lands and gave it to individual Native Americans. And what happened through the Dawes Act was you had about 30, about a third of the percentage of square miles of land within a year or two after the Dawes Act went in. And this was for a lot of, funny business and people buying from individuals and ripping them off, etc. So it served its purpose of really cutting the amount of land Native Americans had. The Dawes Act also wanted to integrate Native populations, and this was a real atrocity. It had children from Native American families put in boarding schools, and they were to lose all semblance of Native culture, language, religion. All of that was to be washed away, and they were to be assimilated. And that went on for many generations, unfortunately, in an attempt to, at the time, assimilate natives into the Western culture. Native American Rights Fund, NARF 1970. You do have some victories there. Again, this is a fund for legal defenses and challenging rules. And this nonprofit organization ensured that U.S. state and federal governments live up to their legal obligations with Indian tribes, organizations, and individuals. Hunting, fishing, land rights victories. You had, you've seen a lot of things from that era. Now casinos are multi-billion-dollar native industries. They're allowed to do whatever, not whatever they want, but to do much of what they want. Little too late, but at least it's something. Asian Americans, the Pan-Asian identity is talked about, and that's a little bit difficult because you have such a difference between Chinese, Japanese, Koreans, Filipinos, Indonesians, Vietnamese. There's so many different groups. Those, what they call Southern Indian, or from India, Pakistan, Kashmir, Bangladesh, and even within those countries, especially China, there's many, many different types of diversity. So the Pan-Asian identity is difficult to articulate. It began, you had a free migration to support the railroad. Again, there's greed there, and we needed workers out west to help build the railroad. So we invited the Chinese, we gave them free migration to the US to support that, and then decided there's too many of them, and in 1882 put forth the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was the first time we forbid people from a certain country to come here. We see some of the remnants of that in Mexicali, where you have still a significant population of Chinese who came during that period of time and have been here over 100 years and have a community in Mexicali. World War II, Korematsu v. US, you had these internment camps set up by FDR. One of the horrible things he did a lot of good things, but he did some bad things too. And that was set up for Japanese citizens as well as Italian and German citizens. And they were put in these camps all around the US. Here, we had a Japanese camp actually in Yuma, just down the road. And the people who were put into those camps, they had to sell all their property at the fire sale prices, otherwise they would lose it. And there were many Japanese American farmers in the Imperial Valley, actually, and they had to sell their land in a rush, and got pennies on the dollar, went to these camps for a year or two, and never came back. And I can't blame them for that. Korematsu v. US was challenged in the Supreme Court. Unfortunately, it's another sad day for the Supreme Court. And they said, oh, well, yes, it's okay. It doesn't violate the 14th Amendment. Now, this later was overturned. in fairly recently in the last 10, 15 years, uh, in the last, excuse me, last 5, 6 years. The Civil Liberties Act in 1988, this is when you had a lot of Japanese Americans who were fighting to get some reparations for this, were given $20,000 each through the Civil Liberties Act in 1988 under President Ronald Reagan. Of course, that's not much money and it's pretty paltry. But the other issue with that is those internment camps that were predominantly Japanese, but also some Italian and Germans. 2/3 of these people were American citizens. So protecting minority groups and diversity, we see American with Disabilities Act in 1990, not that long ago. And prior to this, no protection under the law for people with disabilities. You're kind of screwed. And part of this push was from a lot of disabled veterans returning from the world wars in Korea and Vietnam, that he decided there should be some push for that. And finally, we're just on the cusp of many different groups. LGBTQ saw some victories in the past 5, 6 years, and unfortunately those victories may be somewhat short-lived with this push now with the conservative court to bring the power back to the states. And I just want to say, be wary sometimes when it's always, well, we want to give states the rights. The states' rights, guys, sometimes is genuine, but there's sometimes where it's a cover up for allowing different groups to practice bigoted behavior or to resist change. And it's under the guise of, well, this should be a state issue. And there may be that coming up with LGBTQ rights in the near future, as well as with abortion rights. That being said, watch the video in the module explaining affirmative action. A lot of people don't really understand what it is. This little graph here just shows you some things about the current context of things and the past. So when Social Security began, that's for everybody. 65% of African Americans were excluded from benefits. The GI Bill for home mortgages, and that was also for education. In New York and New Jersey, these are northern states, the first 67,000, fewer than 100 were for non-white people. So there's kind of this built-in structural racism that we've had. Does that mean everyone's racist? Absolutely not. But we can't deny that when we're looking honestly at the issues. And this leads to things, the white household has 13 times as much wealth as average Black household and 10 times as much as the median Hispanic household. And even the college education, well, that's been great. There's been inroads with the African Americans and Hispanic, Latinx community, but still, even with the college education, the wealth gap is huge. Not 7%, 7 times the wealth of a educated Black person and almost 4 times the wealth of a similarly educated Hispanic person. So there's still some room to go there. And check out the video in the module that explains it far better than I. But thank you, and I will see you in the next chapter.